Hey you! Are you a professional wrestling fan? Check out the High Spots Wrestling Network. Hours and hours of the best pro wrestling on the planet. Streaming on your phone, tablet, PC, and available on Roku. Thousands of videos, all the top indie promotions. So what are you waiting for, champ? Head over to www.highspotswrestlingnetwork.com and check it out today. Hashtag HSWN. It's the best $9.99 in the biz.
Oh, Canada. The Great White North, Canada. It's produced some of the top-notch wrestling talent of the past and present that this great sport has ever seen. Our list is proof of that. Now, this list you may not agree with, and if you don't, then you just made the list.
You just made the list!
The following is proof that Canadians may be some of the nicest people on earth, but they also aren't afraid to kick your butt inside the squared circle. You may see some glaring names exempt from our list, as we had a lot to choose from, such as Gene Kiniski, the Vachons, Abdullah the Butcher, Whipper Billy Watson, Lance Storm, and many other great names from Canada. With that being said, let's dive into it.
Who were the great wrestlers to come out of Canada? There was a lot of them. There's a big Canadian influence in professional wrestling to this day.
Who is the greatest Canadian wrestler of all time?
The greatest Canadian wrestler of all time is a very good question.
Who is the greatest Canadian wrestler of all time?
Who is the greatest Canadian wrestler of all time?
Who is the greatest Canadian wrestler of all time?
I think the greatest Canadian wrestler of all time is probably Bret Hart, just based in terms of his accomplishments.
I, as an old school minded guy, I'm tempted to pick somebody like Ed Carpentier.
You've got to look at Don Leo Jonathan. You've got to look at Andre the Giant. You've got to look at Bret Hart, and that's his gimmick, but Bret Hart was the big, great wrestler during this time. You've got to look at
Bret the Hitman Hart.
Chris Jericho. For his longevity, for the way he has transcended eras, the way he has expanded eras.
Owen Hart.
But in my heart of hearts, I know it's probably closer to a Bret the Hitman Hart. And I know that sounds cliche because he spent his whole career, it became a catchphrase. I'm the best there is, the best there was, the best there ever will be. It's an easy answer, but there's a reason it's an easy answer, and that's because his work in the ring bears it out.
Coming in at number 10, Rick Martel. A former AWA World Heavyweight Champion, Rick Martel made his mark in pro wrestling all over the world, but his heel work as the model is what Martel is best known for.
Rick Martel, I think, was a really good wrestler, and in certain ways, his heyday came at a time of transition when the professional wrestling territories were, even the big ones, were falling to the side. He did a good job as champion, but he wasn't quite as, the AWA wasn't quite as over and didn't have it, and kind of lost for that, but also did really well with Vince McMahon and did really well with the WWF after going there.
Rick Martel might be one of the more underrated guys from the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. He was always in magnificent shape. The thing about Rick Martel was he was always kind of a babyface until the WWE gave him this Rick the Model character.
Vince didn't see me as a heel, Pat Patterson either. I said, oh, no way. You're a baby face, everybody likes you. And yeah, because I guess, I always go along with everybody in the ring. In the ring and outside and the people and all that. And they couldn't see me as a heel, They just couldn't. I said, yeah, I know I can do it, I know it. And Vince, no way. And finally, I said, look, Vince, if you don't do it, I'm going to go elsewhere and do it, Oh yeah, well, finally, you know, I gave my notice and that was it. I left, you know. So 2 weeks later, you know, I mean, I get, not 2 weeks later, but a few days later, I get a call and say, look, why don't you come with us? I lived in Cocoa Beach then, and so says, why don't you, we're in Jacksonville, why don't you come up and we'll talk about it. So Vince sat me and Pat Patterson and said, look, okay, you know, we'll do it, you know, you want to do a heel thing, but, you know, we're switching Macho Man, you know, right now, and if we switch you, you know, might take away, you know, so why don't we'll do it, but we'll do it slowly, you know, maybe we can start it. So he says, we're doing TV tomorrow in Tampa, so why don't you come and start a couple of heel interviews, maybe a little bit. And so I go there, and then finally when I go to Tampa, it's all changed. I mean, they want me to do a complete babyface interview, you know. So, oh, fuck, you know, I said, hey. So right away, I didn't say a word. I says, look, guys, I'll be right back, do somebody else, and I'll be back, you know. And I left there. And I said, hey, hell no, you know. I says, I'm not going to wait. 2 weeks later, I'm at home, I get a call, you know, Rick, it's Vince, you know. Oh man, you know, because I already had called Japan and I had booked myself, you know, to other places. So he says, listen, he says, I know what you want and, you know, it's okay, look. He says two things, I remember these words, exact words. He said, look, WWF don't need Rick Martel and Rick Martel doesn't need WWF. So let's go from there. So I'm sure we can work something out. So I came back and we talked about doing it somehow, and then, you know, with Tito and all that, and yeah, very good. So then I didn't have a gimmick, right? So I said, well, what gimmick? I didn't know. I thought about the whole thing, but I didn't think about a gimmick. You know, I know I want to be a heel, but what? You know. So he said, yeah, I get a call. I mean, I get a meeting with him and J.J. Dillon, and he says, we're going to call you the model. So I guess J.J. Dillon came up with that thing, because I used to, you know, like to dress up, and they said, well, I'd see Rick as a model, it'd be great. And so I remember I called my wife that night, I says, oh man, I said, Joanne, I says, you know, the gimmick they came up with me is the model. I says, what am I going to do with that? She says, well, you know, just be thankful they didn't come up with a gimmick like the Rooster. You know? It could have been worse, you know, because...
As a kid, I hated Rick Martel, but I was supposed to. He was a heel. But he was, to me, a solid hand, but his character work put him over the top.
The model Rick Martel was one of the classic heels of my childhood. Just the way he would carry himself and, you know, look up like he was almost looking down at people, and he had the arrogance, perfume, and just he looked like a guy that you would just want to punch in the face.
Usually people look at those hokey kind of characters and say, oh man, here it goes, he's going to become a cartoon. Rick Martel was great in that role. He made people mad. He was very Pepe Le Pew-like. It revealed a whole new side to Rick Martel. And by the way, that whole time he was a tremendous wrestler.
I loved it. Man, because all those years as a babyface, you know, it's like, let's say you work in a department store, and you know, of course there's a lot of nice people. Some people you'd like to say, hey, listen, you bitch, you know, if you don't like this, you know, screw it and get out of my fucking store. But you can't say that, because you have to be, same thing as a babyface, you know, you hear all kinds of comments, but you want to get, you know, a lot of frustration in there. But finally, you know, as a heel, you can let all that heat ventilate, you know, and say whatever you want and whatever, you know. And as a heel also, you can create so much more. The creative side of it is, and creating, and that gimmick, the model there, that was so much fun.
I hated everything about him when I was younger. I just, like, he came on TV spraying this, I think it was Essence. He'd spray out that stupid little sprayer all over the place, and it made me want to just go through the television and slap him. But, I mean, he was a snobby prick as a character, and I feel like that was what he was supposed to be. So, yeah, he was a great heel. Like, again, he was solid and, I mean, underrated as far as work goes.
Coming in at number 9, Jacques Rougeau. Coming from a famous wrestling family and being a part of one of the great tag teams of the 1980s, the fabulous Rougeua brothers, Jacques went on to far more success later in his career as the Mountie.
I am the Mountie.
As far as wrestling is concerned, for people that aren't wrestling fans, everybody knows what wrestling is, and in Quebec everybody knows the Rougeau family and him in particular. So back then, and I started training with him in 2000, he had just came, you know, he had pretty good runs in WWF as the Mountie and all that stuff in the Quebecers, and then in 98 he went back to WWE, well WWF back then with Pierre-Carl Ouellet, and they were the Quebecers, and I remember going to house shows and they were on and cheering for them, and you know, like, oh, they're from where I am, so I have to love them, even though really I prefer the New Age Outlaws, but no, they're from this, so I have to cheer for them. But so when I started training with him, it was a big deal.
Jacques Rougeau, the Mountie. Jacques Rougeau was really good. He's another guy who came from a wrestling family. His brother Raymond was his tag team partner for a little while, and then he became the Mountie. Which the actual Canadian Mounties didn't appreciate much, but he was kind of a Dudley Do-Right character that zapped people with a taser. And, but he was really good in the ring. He's a little bit polarizing figure. I know Kevin Owens doesn't care for him very much.
Jacques Rougeau, kind of a controversial figure in professional wrestling.
You know what? I've always been a very honest and kind person, but I've always believed in my work. And I think today, now that I look back, that I'm a normal human being.
My memories of Jacques Rougeau would be his WWF era. Jacques Rougeau as the Mountie in the Quebecers. Thought he had amazing charisma. His accent was perfect to be a heel at the time, when the heels would be subjected to basically having one stereotype, and he would be the Frenchman who yelled at the camera.
Jacques Rougeau was around when I was younger. I didn't watch much of his stuff. He would come on television and I would turn it. Because, again, being a child, being younger, he never appealed to me. But, I mean, his name is pretty well known, and his reputation is that he was a good worker in the ring. He was great in the ring, but, again, I never watched him much.
I was probably critical of Jock sometimes, you know, for being, you know, just some things, you know. But the truth was, he was easy to work with. He was more like honky tonk, right? You know, you weren't getting that solid kind of match, and in a lot of ways, he kind of got a little lazy. But at the same time, he had a lot of heat. People hated him, and he was a night off, you know, every night, you know. And I don't remember ever not getting a reaction.
The first vignette I do was the Mountie, Royal Canadian Mounted Police. I guess Vince already had Big Boss Man in mind, you know. He's always seen the shots ahead of time, and Canadian law enforcement against American law enforcement. And my first vignette I did, Vince brings the whole crew up to Canada, and he films me on my horse and doing vignettes with the guy in a park. He has to pick up bird shit, and I'm making him do stuff like that, being a big arrogant Mountie. But anyway, the car stops beside my horse and me, and sorry if I can't take this grin off my face. This is good. Nothing personal, but this is good. Anyway, I'm on my horse, and this supposedly American guy stops by with his wife, and he says, excuse me, officer, excuse me, officer. He says, I look at him and say, I'm not the officer, I'm the Mountie. And so the guy looks at me like, whoa, what a weirdo. He looks at his wife like, this guy's a weirdo. And then he turns around and says, excuse me, Mr. Mountie, can you tell me how to get back to the States? He says, I'm lost. So I look at him, and I get off my horse. And I get off my horse, and I look at him in the car, and I said, follow me. So the guy looks at his wife. Jesus. Anyway, so he gets out of the car, and he comes towards me, and I get in front of my horse, and I take my horse like this, and I lift his head up. So you see this part of my horse? It always faces Canada. Come here. So I put the horse down, I go in the back of my horse, and I take the tail up. And I swear to God, the asshole is this big. And I say, you see this? This always points to the States. You know? And the guy looks at me, turns around, gets back in the car. Anyway, it was just a funny vignette for me. And I was playing like 5 weeks before I ever came in the territory.
I remember mostly as the Mountie. I thought, what a gimmick that got so much heat. I remember him actually beating Bret Hart for the Intercontinental Championship on a house show, non-televised live event. And then I remember him losing it a couple days later to Roddy Piper, and I was very ecstatic about that. And then, of course, he went on to team with the guy now known as PCO, as the Quebecers.
I always liked Jock, but I don't know if I really loved working with him.
I think I had a great life. I had a lot of ups and downs, mostly ups.
Our first honorable mention goes to Captain Charisma, Christian, or to TNA fans, Christian Cage.
Christian, I think only up until now, is getting the credit he deserves.
Christian was a guy who was underutilized for the majority of his career. He should have been in a similar position to Edge, and he always played second fiddle to Edge.
Christian was kind of a great utility player. He was great in tag teams. He was great with comedy. He could be a heel. He was really good, really versatile. His partnership with Edge will go down in history, the 5-second pose, and he was good in the ring, and he was a guy that was as easy to hate as he was to like, and I guess that's a good thing.
Christian was another glue guy for WWE, and that you could put him just about in any position on the card, and he's going to give you the tremendous performance. He's going to he can talk, he can move, he can make somebody else look good, he can look good himself. You need those type of guys in every promotion. He wasn't a main eventer even to the level of his partner Edge, but he was someone who was always credible and always effective wherever you put him on the card.
Christian had the remarkable ability to turn the most terrible gimmicks, the most awful angles and storylines, and make gold out of them just by putting his own spin on it.
I thought Christian deserved so much more because whether it was in ring, on the microphone, the way he carried himself, Christian always came off as a superstar, and unfortunately he was never pushed to that level.
Christian is the epitome of charisma. Fantastic wrestler. And another one of those that no matter what, he would always reinvent himself and do anything that he could do to make sure that he had a job.
He's a great storyteller. Christian had great psychology. And Christian was another guy that was able to reinvent himself every couple years to make himself fresh, whether it was cutting his hair, changing his look, changing his music. Out of the Edge and Christian team, obviously I think Christian is the one that doesn't get the credit he deserves.
Coming in at number 8, PCO. PCO has risen from the dead to take the wrestling world by storm in his 50s. After having successful runs in WWE and WCW, PCO fell off the face of the earth only to come back from the dead as a modern-day Frankenstein with Destro by his side.
PCO is a guy who I had literally forgotten about for who knows how many years until his resurgence, which has been absolutely incredible.
For a while there, I'd probably say he was one of my best friends and just definitely somebody that helped me a lot in wrestling. Maybe not necessarily in sending me places, but teaching me about wrestling and what I was missing from Jacques, which is, instead of just doing wrestling matches that I knew, like by heart, just to learn how to work and how to, feel a crowd and stuff like that. He was definitely the one that introduced me to that concept and helped me out a little bit.
PCO, Carl Ouellet, the Jean-Pierre Lafitte. This guy has had 9 lives and then some, and that's just in the past 6 weeks. He came back out of nowhere multiple times in his career. He was a Quebecer. He disappeared. He comes back as a pirate, wrestles Bret Hart. He disappears again, shows up in ECW of all places, ends up in WCW. All of a sudden, the Quebecers are back together. And today, in the year of our Lord 2019, this guy is out there smashing people in Ring of Honor.
He was a good star in WWE and ran into some political problems, but still he was very effective as that pirate character, and then came back and reinvented himself. And for my money is the spiritual, I guess that's the way to put it, but descendant of the Undertaker. I mean, he's got the gimmick where there's some mysticism in it, there's some monster in it that really fans that see it like it.
When they say PCO's not human, I think that's pretty accurate. I mean, some of the ideas that he brings to the table are out of this world, and the things that he's willing to do to his body are remarkable, even at his age. Not that he's old or anything, but he still will just go out there and lay it all on the line for the fans.
Comes back as PCO, has the great match with Walter at Joey Janela's spring break, and now is having a great run in ROH and is one of the biggest stars in Ring of Honor, even at his age. And all right, he can't go in the ring anymore, but the gimmick is so good that people love him every time he's out there.
The absolute man. Listen to me. PCO is the greatest human being on the planet. He's the biggest sweetheart I've ever met in my life. He's one of the most scary human beings on the planet. He's insane. But he is more than willing to put his body on the line to make anybody look good. Anybody. And I mean, of course, some of the stuff he does might not be the smartest, but I bet money anytime PCO comes through the curtain, you're going to get your money's worth.
He was basically the definition of just another guy until this resurgence out of nowhere a couple of years ago due to Joey Janela's spring break. And since then, it's been unbelievable the way he's capitalized on it. A guy his age doing the stuff that he does. It's honestly, it should be an inspiration to all older wrestlers who think that their time in the business is done. It only takes that one match for people now to take notice because of the way videos can go viral or how things can take off in various forms on the internet. You can make a whole career starting at the age of 50 if you really want to, if you have the dedication and the hard work to do so.
He's gone viral. He puts videos online of himself doing these like absolutely ludicrous feats of strength and pain threshold. And I just can't believe, and I admire the longevity that PCO has given himself in the wrestling business.
He's thrown caution to the wind and he said, hold my beer. This is my last run. You about to find out who PCO really is. And he has went nuts.
He's not human. He has Destro where he shocks him to wake him up, and sometimes he malfunctions. He's essentially a Frankenstein character in professional wrestling.
He suicide dives to the wrong side of the ring with nobody there. Do I need to say anything else?
I'm so pleased to see the way that PCO has resurfaced and become such a cult-like figure in professional wrestling. And it just goes to show you that, like, you know, anything at any time, given the time, can stick and draw attention and eyes and money.
Coming in at number 7 on our list of top Canadians, Kevin Owens.
Probably the wrestler I get referenced to more than anybody on the planet.
Kevin Owens, maybe the greatest Canadian wrestler in the current era. Kevin Owens was a guy who many people didn't think would succeed because of his body type, but he was so good on the mic, undeniable on the microphone, and in the ring he could, hold his own. He showed that you don't have to just have six-pack abs to get yourself over and to be a star in the world of professional wrestling. You can have kind of a gut, but if you're just undeniable on the microphone and in the ring, you're going to make waves and you're going to get pushed, and Kevin Owens, especially when he goes to Canada, gets the biggest reception of anybody on the roster and comes off as a complete superstar in Canada.
Kevin Owens is another one of those who never let his body hold him back.
I'm an exception to the rule. You should work out. You should be in shape. You should look good. Because being an exception, it doesn't mean it's going to work for everybody. And it hasn't worked for everybody. There's a lot of guys that look like me out there. But I am the only one that looks like me that's at the level I'm at now. And I like to think that's because I'm talented and I have a lot to offer besides this.
Kevin Owens is one of the latter-day legends, I guess I would call him. He is a really good all-around performer in that he is absolutely stinging with his one-liners. You do not want to get into a verbal joust with him, and definitely don't want to tag him on social media. He's an amazing pro wrestler.
Kevin Owens has, everywhere he's gone, he's had look at the bad body or look at the bad look, and then he's gotten himself over. He can talk, he can wrestle, he can, he's a major, he's a major content provider, I guess is the way to put it, for WWE. He's not at the very top, but he can be put in those positions, and he can do anything they want him to do. He can be a heel, he can be a babyface, and in a time where talking is just not as the promo ability is not that good, he's a damn good promo.
If there was ever like the biggest loudmouth award in Canadian history, it would probably go to Kevin Owens. And I think that's where his bread and butter is talking and his ability to run his mouth, and also somehow in a weird way change inflections, and he can go from being kind of witty to charming to being a jerk to being ruthless. I mean, he's just got such a unique range of character that I don't think a lot of people give him credit for. And I think that's why Kevin is able to be a top guy everywhere he's gone, and I think he'll continue to be a top guy everywhere he goes.
Kevin Owens is an incredible all-around performer. He has the ability to work inside the ring. He has the gift of gab. He can cut amazing promos. He can think on his feet. He's an example of a guy who can succeed doing a WWE-style scripted promo or on his own just coming up with words in his head.
I'm a fan who wrestles. That might sound really awful, but that is what I am.
And the fact that he learned English by watching wrestling, it's pretty inspirational when you think about it. He's fantastic on the mic. Physically, looking at him, you wouldn't think that he can do 3/4 of the stuff that he can do. And that I can appreciate, being 300 pounds, and I get the same thing. But I feel like he has broken down a wall as well for a lot of guys like myself whose look might not be the greatest, and he said, hey guys, if I can do it, you can too.
He makes you feel something about him, whether you want to reach through the screen and try to choke the life out of him, or whether or not he has a weird way of making you laugh and you're like, man, this guy's kind of a charming individual. But Kevin Owens, or Kevin Steen, has an innate ability to make you feel one way or the other about him.
I think that he would be the perfect example of a guy who could be the spokesman for a company. As when I've seen him do public appearances, he just has a way of connecting with people, making them laugh, making them not make a joke out of the professional wrestling business.
Kevin Owens made himself, he was one of those independent guys like a CM Punk, like a Samoa Joe, like a Daniel Bryan, to where he catapulted himself using the independents, whether it was Ring of Honor, PWG. He was so good in the ring, on the microphone during that time, that WWE had to take notice of him, even if he didn't have the look of a superstar.
Kevin Owens is one of the bright spots of the modern wrestling era.
I'm just a guy who loves to wrestle and is lucky enough to get to do it a lot. And I'm a dad, and I'm a husband, and that's pretty much the best way to sum me up. I'm a guy who loves wrestling and has a great family.
He is a guy that I would be happy represented Canada going forward as the face of Canadian wrestling.
Our next honorable mention is a guy known as the Russian Bear, but could be considered the Canadian Bear, Ivan Koloff.
I don't consider him to be a Canadian wrestler. I never knew he was Canadian.
Ivan Koloff. I didn't even know he was Canadian.
Comrade, I could just see it now. August 25th, 1942. Great Russian champion born. Yeah, that's actually the date I was born on, up in, it's not Moscow, but a little area beside Moscow called Canada. Yeah, I was raised up in, born and raised in Ontario.
One of the most terrifying bad guys of all time. When you mention the name of Ivan Koloff, you see the days of when fans and other wrestlers feared the bad guy, feared the opponent. And if I were a wrestler in one corner and Ivan Koloff were in the other corner, I'd be afraid, because the man just exuded fear.
I used to enjoy watching his matches because it didn't matter who you put Ivan Koloff in there with, that he made it a match. He made it a match. So my favorite TV matches, of course, was with Ivan.
When I think of Ivan Koloff, the Russian Bear, I think of box office. Ivan was one of the most successful guys in the wrestling business. When you put Ivan Koloff on the marquee, that meant big, big business for the promoter.
Well, when I look over my whole career in professional wrestling, which lasted 25 years, when you mention the name Koloff, I think of one of my really favorite opponents.
Oh, Ivan's legendary. Lots of different comments from people, I'm sure, over the years. One of the main things I think about with Ivan, out of all the time I've spent with him and the people I know that know him, I don't know that I've ever heard a cross word about Ivan Koloff. He was the consummate worker, the consummate professional.
Ivan Koloff is most famous for defeating Bruno Sammartino in Madison Square Garden for the WWF title.
The night in the Garden when he became the champion, that was I really believe to this day that there was a first in the history of wrestling, because people were so stunned that night that there was fear of a riot, but it was the opposite. You could have heard a pin drop. We had 22,000 people in Madison Square Garden. You could have heard people were so shocked they were paralyzed. They couldn't believe it, because I had been champion at that time for 8 years.
The match was pretty well typical. People responding to, the different spots and enjoying it. You could tell they're always behind Bruno. The people, no matter where you went to wrestle, but they're right behind him in that match also. And I noticed that whenever I went up to the top and came off one, and I covered him like it was just like 1, 2, and you expect a kickoff, but it's 3, and you get up and I raised my own hand like that. And what's the referee says, raise my hand, like, where's the belt, like that. And he said, no. I mean, everybody went so quiet in there. They didn't believe it. They thought probably they're going to say, no, continue the match. You can't do that or something, Sure. But it didn't happen that way. It ended up, it held, like, and so the people couldn't believe it. And they're real quiet. You could hear a pin drop.
Ivan Koloff beating Bruno Sammartino is a memory that I will never, ever, ever forget. People who were there, and I was one of them, I was photographing the match for Inside Wrestling and The Wrestler back then. And when Ivan Koloff came off that top rope and did the knee drop, and I thought Bruno was going to kick out, and he got the 1, 2, 3, everyone at the Garden, the fans, everyone, I think even the referee was like, whoa, I can't believe this has finally happened after all these years. There was a dead silence.
He was always one of my favorites as far as to wrestle with, because I felt that when I wrestled him, we gave the people their money's worth, because every time I wrestled him, believe me, we beat the heck out of each other.
I have so many people, and even among the fans, that end up talking to me with a lot of respect and, and looking up to me, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And I don't feel necessarily deserve all that, but I just feel that it's something that I cherish, because it's something I wanted to do all my life.
Coming in at number 6 is the rated R superstar, Edge. Edge has truly done it all in pro wrestling. Retiring in 2011 due to the risk of a neck-down paralysis, Edge walked away as one of the most decorated pro wrestlers of all time.
Edge was a guy that really defied a lot of the odds, because his first match in WWE, he essentially ended someone's career with the spot he did, with the plancha spot that he did, and he overcame that to become one of the bigger stars in this era, especially transforming himself into the rated R superstar.
Edge is one of my all-time favorites.
Edge was super good at just everything you could ask for. And I feel like he was marketable, because at the time that he came around, he started doing the rated R superstar gimmick and things like that, that that was when rock music was starting to take that turn where 3/4 of the lead singers looked like Edge. So he appealed to every demographic. Kids loved him because the music that they were listening to was cool. The women loved him because, I mean, they felt like he was attractive, and the guys loved him because they liked the music too. But if you was one of the guys that just hated that type of music, then whatever. But Edge as a wrestler and a person, he is extremely good.
Edge had the looks, had the charisma. He was definitely a guy who, as soon as you saw him, you knew this guy had the ability to be a star.
When he broke out on his own, away from Christian, he became a huge single star. And I think not a lot of people knew how far Edge was going to go. But I remember specifically him cutting a promo on Matt Hardy where he had this intense look in his eyes. And I think that's really where the Rated R Superstar character started. And I think that's when they knew that, like, Edge is going to be a world champion. He's going to be a main eventer. He's going to be a top guy.
Edge did a magnificent job of putting himself in the main event spot and holding on to it. He stepped up to the plate. He was really good in the ring, and he was not afraid to try risky things like, you know, a lot of the riskier storylines. He went through fire with Cactus Jack, the whole thing with Lita, the Rated R Superstar era. He started off as kind of a spot guy, you know, with the Hardy Boys and the Dudley Boys, but I'll tell you, Edge has a lot of really legendary matches in WWE. He's got a lot to be proud of.
Coming in at number 5 on the list of Canada's greatest wrestlers, Owen Hart.
Owen Hart, you know, one of the worst tragedies in wrestling history.
Owen Hart, a beloved pro wrestler, a Canadian legend. It's extremely unfortunate that he is best known for the way he died. He was such a locker room, I guess. It sounds like everybody who was in the locker room with him loved him.
The best Hart to ever step foot in the ring.
Owen Hart in the ring, bell to bell, might be the greatest Canadian wrestler of all time because everything he did was so smooth. He could wrestle any style that you wanted him to wrestle.
This guy's such a great worker, and he was such a great worker at that time. And even years before when he worked Stampede, Owen was an awesome worker. And he was, one of the things I always loved about Owen was he was nothing like me. You know, when you watched Owen, you didn't go, he's trying to copy his brother, you know. Owen had a distinct, different way of doing everything that I did. He did a lot of high flying, a lot of different stuff. The only thing I think he did, and he didn't do it as well, but he did the front turnbuckles. That's about the only thing he ever borrowed from me. Right. Everything else was different. You know, he was a completely different wrestler than me, and that says a lot. He never copied or patterned himself off me at all.
As far as being a pro wrestler, he was so funny, so witty, so good. He was like Bret Hart with a vicious streak. He was like his brother with a chip on his shoulder.
Owen Hart. He was doing the cool stuff before the cool stuff was cool. And when he was in Japan, I mean, geez, Owen was unreal. But he was always living in his brother's shadow.
Owen Hart was the great Hart.
Owen Hart is another guy that kind of revolutionized a new style of professional wrestling here in the States and in North America. Owen, I don't think I ever saw Owen Hart have a bad match. You know, a guy that we lost way too soon and a guy that should have had a run as world heavyweight champion, and it's a shame that he didn't.
Owen could play any character that you wanted him to play, whether it was serious, whether comedy. Owen was so diverse in the ring and on the microphone as a performer that he really, I mean, he has to be up there at the top of the list, and I think bell to bell might be the best.
I personally feel like Owen got short end of the stick, and had the tragic event not happened, Owen would be remembered as the best wrestler to come out of Canada and not Bret.
Number 4 on our list of top Canadians is the cleaner, Kenny Omega.
If anybody doubts that Kenny Omega's not a star, or if anybody doubts that he is a star, like, you need to get your head out of your ass, because the guy not only can perform in the ring, but he's shown that he can be big box office too.
There's nothing I was more a fan of than wrestling. I was raised in a hockey family, so hockey was our #1 sport, and I loved hockey too. We had an NHL team in Winnipeg, the Winnipeg Jets, So I was a firm supporter of that all throughout my childhood years. I wanted to be either a professional goalie or a professional wrestler.
Right.
As I got older, I sort of fell out of love with hockey and fell more into love with wrestling. So it was only natural to go into that direction.
I don't think the book on Kenny Omega is even close to being written yet, but so far, so good.
Kenny Omega is another one of those who wasn't really appreciated until late in his career. And now he's touted as one of the best in the world.
At the height of my faniness, I was just ripping off stuff from guys that I liked with really no thought towards, how it fit into a match or whatever. I just wanted to do guys that I liked moves. So I wanted to do Rolling Thunder from RVD or whatever, and I wanted to do Kenta's Combination from Noah, and just Van Terminator and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Just cool moves. That's all I cared about. I didn't have any bit of originality in me. I was just too much of a fan that was wrestling in a ring.
Kenny Omega is certainly one of the bigger Canadian stars today, and he's a guy who got himself over with his bell-to-bell work.
It wasn't until I came back from Deep South Wrestling that I started to look at the business in a different light. And I started to look at how can I become more original? How can I make this enjoyable again? And so that's when I started to implement things from video games, or just come up with new moves that I felt that no one could duplicate with quite as much punch or quite as much pizzazz. And I didn't want to just take things from people anymore. I wanted to have kind of my own style, my own moves, my own original move set.
There's nothing he can't do. There really isn't. Comedy, serious, straightforward wrestling.
I think one of the guys responsible for the boom of New Japan Pro Wrestling would have to be Kenny Omega.
He was one of the biggest stars in Japan during this era, and we're talking an era with Kazuchika Okada, Hiroshi Tanahashi, and Kenny Omega was up there right with them, presented even greater than them. And when it comes to in-ring work, Kenny Omega's style, it's tough to have a bad match with Kenny Omega, and his style, his action, balls to the wall, wrestling style connects with a lot of fans nowadays.
It certainly feels like I've done something. I've made some kind of impact on my grand mission.
Some of the classic matches that he has put on with Okada, the first ever 6-star match, I believe, and according to Dave Meltzer.
Here's the best thing you can say about Kenny Omega. He and Kazuchika Okada in New Japan got Dave Meltzer to add an additional star to his 5-star match rating system, essentially moving the bar for what was considered a perfect or excellent pro wrestling match.
Kenny Omega, right now he's reestablishing himself in AEW, but best wrestler in the world.
Kenny Omega going forward, I see as the face of Canadian pro wrestling. I think that he's only going to get more popular with how he's expanding now. He's going to be on national television. I believe it's a shame, really, that he's not known yet, because he's done so much for professional wrestling that it's taken him just to get on national TV for people to take notice.
Kenny is a marketing genius. He's super personable. And when I met him at WrestleCon, he couldn't have been any cooler as far as a human being goes. But I believe him and Jericho are the lifeblood of AEW, and those two could probably put it on their back and carry it themselves.
Omega is amazing. Omega has charisma. Omega is going to go down in history, I think, as one of the greats, unless something really unbelievable happens to send him in reverse. I don't see that happening. And by the way, he's got guts, because he went head-to-head with WWE, turned down a WWE offer, and went with a brand new company, and is betting on himself to help lead that company into success. So hats off to Kenny Omega.
I just want to do the best job that I can, and if I'm remembered for it, that's a bonus,
Coming in at number 3, Roddy Piper.
He was Canadian?
Billed from Glasgow, Roddy was actually born in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, as Roderick Toome, who later was to be dubbed the Rowdy One.
The name Roddy Piper came as I was coming to the ring. The announcer didn't know who I was. He knew it was Roddy. And he said, and here comes all these bagpipers. Ladies and gentlemen, what do you want to call him, Larry? Yeah, I know what I'd like to call you. Roddy the Piper. And the just got dropped, and I don't know where the Rowdy came from. And that's exactly how I got it.
One of the all-time great, heels in professional wrestling, got over in the, was a big star in the heyday of Georgia Championship Wrestling, was a big star in Portland wrestling, just changed wrestling in the Carolinas.
Roddy Piper, again, probably a top 10 guy for me. One of the greatest villains of all time.
My own personal favorite Canadian pro wrestler of all time is absolutely Roddy Piper. Roddy Piper was hands down untouchable on the microphone. He was witty, he was funny. Even if you hated him, he'd make you crack a smile because he was so quick.
Roddy Piper is one of those performers that, in wrestling or anything else, that one of those few performers I remember exactly where I was and what I was doing when I saw him.
Roddy Piper, one of the best to ever do it on the microphone. Give the guy a microphone, let him talk for 5-6 minutes, and promos are a lost art nowadays. Roddy Piper was the promo king during his time, and in the ring during the end of his career certainly couldn't go, but Roddy Piper told a story in the ring.
The thing about Roddy Piper that I love so much is that his attitude matches his wrestling style. He doesn't get in there hoping to emulate Bret Hart or the Dynamite Kid and be the guy with all the moves of the flashy, offense. He gets in there and fights people. He'll stand there and poke you in the eye without moving another muscle. Just, shortcuts, mean stuff, and just, he's there to fight and to win, and then he's gonna mock you on the interview afterwards. And the Hot Rod is an all-time great and my personal favorite.
Everybody is going on TV, and the way they're trying to get over, they're killing each other. Boom, boom. They got to pay for that. I said, you give me a bow tie and a munch stand 5 weeks. If I don't get the job done, I'll get out. And the next TV, there was a Piper's Pit.
He was an innovator with Piper's Pit. See, the wrestling business is more than just getting in the ring and exchanging holds and sweating and bleeding and whatever. The wrestling business is entertainment. It's about being able to talk people into buying tickets. Roddy Piper did that better than anybody, and I'll even say he did that better than Hulk Hogan.
He was another guy who had the gift of gab. He could talk anybody into coming to a building to see any feud. He knew exactly what to say. He knew the appropriate intensity to give. He was truly something special that we may not ever see again in this business. One of the last of his kind.
WrestleMania, there is no Hulk Hogan without Roddy Piper.
He headlined the first WrestleMania. Hogan, he was always that second, unfortunately he was the second fiddle to Hogan, but he was always the antagonist to Hogan. And so one of the biggest stars of his generation, one of the greatest talkers of all time.
Leading into that first WrestleMania, man, they say that people didn't come to WrestleMania, the first one anyways, to see Hulk Hogan. They came to see Hulk Hogan beat up Roddy Piper.
Without Roddy Piper, wrestling looks way different for the worse. WrestleMania maybe doesn't happen, or certainly wouldn't have been as good without Roddy Piper. They maybe don't get on MTV twice before the first WrestleMania, which launched this whole thing. Cyndi Lauper loved Roddy Piper. Anybody you ask these days who was involved in those times, they might mention Andre the Giant, they might mention Hulk Hogan, but everybody, you bring up Roddy Piper, like, oh, the Hot Rod, He raised hell, and he was absolutely perfect in my view.
You get a guy, you put all your money down on him, and you have WrestleMania and War to Settle the Score, and both of them are huge successes. Who draws money in wrestling? Who's responsible for the art of drawing money? The heel. Yes, you must have a great opponent, but when you have all the people we've talked to about earlier, and yes, Cyndi Lauper was sister, saying Roddy Piper's going to get your ass kicked, Roddy Piper. They have the wrestlers who Roddy Piper are, which ones they're going for, and everything is, and Cyndi Lauper. It's pretty right in your face that the reason they came for War to Settle the Score and carry over for WrestleMania 1 is they want somebody to shut this big mouth guy up.
On top of that, one of the greatest all-time talkers, such a unique look with the shirt and the kilt. And again, another guy that'll go down as somebody that was, their work was, at least on the microphone, was timeless.
Roddy Piper is the greatest heel of my lifetime. He is the most interesting person I've ever seen cut a promo.
He's right up there at the very top. And, you know, They Live and all that. He's one of the most recognizable wrestlers of my lifetime.
Roddy Piper speaks for himself. He's one of the greatest wrestlers, period, that ever stepped foot in a professional wrestling ring.
Coming in at number 2 is the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be, Bret the Hitman Hart.
You look at the Hart family, Stu Hart and particularly Bret and Owen Hart, and Bret Hart even using Canadian pride as a way to bond Canadians and bond Americans against Canada.
Bret Hart, in my opinion, greatest Canadian wrestler of all time. Bret had an ability to pull out the best matches out of his opponents, no matter who it might be.
The only real criticism that I ever really hear about Bret Hart is that he had trouble on promos, which is true earlier in his career, but I would like to think that his work in 1997 as the head of the Hart Foundation did a lot to erase that from people's minds. I mean, that was tremendous. He knew how to draw heat in America. He knew how to be a hero in Canada.
Bret the Hitman Hart believed he was the greatest Canadian wrestler of all time, and I think that is what makes people connect with him. You know, people nowadays, the older generation, they want wrestling to be real, and Bret Hart was most certainly, he believed everything was real. He presented himself as the greatest wrestler. He believed it 100% in his mind that no one could touch him in the ring, and very few could. Everything he did in the ring looked believable.
Everybody loves Bret. Everybody loves Bret. I personally could give or take Bret Hart. I'm not saying that I don't respect what he done in the ring, because he was a good babyface. He could sell. He bumped his rear end off. He worked really hard for everybody he got in the ring with, but I feel like that he was super generic. I also feel like that if you've seen one Bret Hart match, you've seen almost all Bret Hart matches. I will say that the match he had with Stone Cold, where Stone Cold got busted open, he's laying in the sharpshooter, bleeding all over the place, might have been one of my favorite matches ever. But I feel like Bret got all of the praise that Owen deserved.
He could get in there and, of course, have a technical classic with a Mr. Perfect or a Shawn Michaels. But then he could also brawl with a Stone Cold Steve Austin. But then when you put him in there with a Diesel or a Vader or a Psycho Sid, Bret's pulling these great matches out of these guys that could be considered limited at the time in the things that they're capable of pulling off. But again, Bret, one of the all-time, just, I don't know, he's like the master of psychology and in-ring storytelling.
Bret Hart will tell you himself he's the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be. Who am I to argue with the greatest? But he was absolutely one of the better technicians. The thing about Bret Hart was when he did moves, they were so crisp and so flawless and perfect. His timing was perfect. He likes to tell people that he never injured anybody. It's probably true or close to true, because everything he did was textbook. And that's the sign of a true pro, and it's the sign of a guy who takes his profession very seriously. And I don't know if anybody took pro wrestling more seriously than Bret the Hitman Hart.
He is looked at as Canada's representative in the world of professional wrestling.
When you're talking about just greatest stars in Canada, it's tough to top Bret Hart. Even during his heel run in WWF, you know, he elicited so much heat in the United States. But when he went to Canada, he was on a level of a Wayne Gretzky in Canada with the reactions he would get. Bret Hart, I'm not sure there was a bigger star in wrestling history in Canada.
So if it's not Bret Hart, who would top the list above the best there ever will be?
I guess the only person left on your list would have to be Chris Jericho.
And coming in at number 1, topping the list of Canada's greatest wrestlers, Chris Jericho.
I don't think he's Whipper Watson, but yeah, he's, you know, as far as someone in this era, he's shown more and more. And I still, you know, there's still people who doubt him. There's still, you know, every once in a while I still hear doesn't know how to run the ropes right. Well, really? Because seems to me that most people don't know that, and they see him as a great wrestler and a great star. You pay attention when he's out there.
Chris Jericho is 50 years old now, and he's still performing at a high level, probably one of the highest levels. So I normally don't do this, but in the list of greatest Canadian professional wrestlers, 1A, Chris Jericho, 1B, Owen Hart.
Chris Jericho is slowly, not even slowly, he's on his way to becoming one of the greatest of all time. I think he already is one of the greatest of all time.
Chris Jericho started in the early 90s, ECW, WCW, WWE, now All Elite Wrestling, and he's still on top.
Chris Jericho is the chameleon. Chris Jericho changes with the times in incredible ways, and everything he does works. It's incredible. He comes out, he starts in Mexico, he went through Smoky Mountain, WCW, another guy who got himself over in WCW when they may not necessarily have planned for him to get over the way he did.
Chris Jericho, honestly, he would be one of the most incredible, he is one of the most incredible performers in my mind, just based on the sense that he made himself into a star. I don't believe any company ever gave him a fair shake. He had to take the little he was given and run with it.
He is in his mid-40s, and he is still putting out some of the best matches of his career, cutting some of the best promos of his career, and constantly changing the game as Jericho.
Jericho has reinvented himself a million times over the years. The goof gets over a list, stupid idiot, and bubbly, and makes people care about this stuff. His in-ring work, it speaks for itself, but the fact that as a character, he can make you care about anything. He can draw an emotional response out of anything. He just had a match with Darby Allin on AEW that was just, it was bonkers. Absolute bonkers. But I mean, you don't see a 50-year-old man going in there and doing what he does.
He's recreated himself again in AEW, where he's the figure that the veteran who gives that promotion credibility in the ring.
Chris Jericho gets this business, and he does it better than just about anybody, pound for pound, in a year-over-year basis. He's never the same in a 10-year stretch. And the fact that you can even say that shows you what kind of longevity he has.
In a weird way, Jericho has branded himself unlike anybody else, because Jericho appeals to wrestling fans for obvious reasons. Now with the band Fozzy, Jericho appeals to rock and roll fans, or music fans. But then there's also just Chris Jericho fans, the people that like Chris Jericho. So he has been able to brand himself unlike anybody else I've ever seen in professional wrestling. And there's something to be said for that. I think Jericho helped New Japan boom recently with his match with Omega. He's also one of the big people to give credit for the boom of All Elite Wrestling.
He's still a star today. He's constantly been able to change his look. He's one of the best I've ever seen at adapting to the current wrestling business, both inside and outside the ring. And I foresee him lasting many more years as long as he continues to follow the way he's been doing for the last 5 years.
He is a global icon, whether that's from his rock star persona, all of that. Chris Jericho, All Elite Wrestling would not be where they're at without Chris Jericho. He was the first undisputed champion. Chris Jericho, to me, is the greatest Canadian wrestler of all time.
Now that it's settled that Chris Jericho is the greatest Canadian wrestler of all time, according to us at the High Spots Wrestling Network, we hope that you have enjoyed this presentation of High Spot's greatest Canadian wrestlers of all time.
Hey, at High Spots WN, the best $9.99 in the business, huh? Get it now. Best $9.99 in the business! What up, man? The best $9.99. Best $9.99 in the business. Best $9.99. However, best $9.99 in the business, y'all. Best $9.99 in the business. Anyway, $9.99. $9.99. Why aren't you getting it now? They don't $9.99 in the business. That's why they don't need it. What up?
You're not gonna find content like this on.
Whoa.
Mother.
What? Whoa! The best $9.99 you'll ever spend. Oh my God, that rhymed! Beer